Have you ever wondered whether or not you should punch your friend in the face just because? Or should you really bring that shopping cart all the way back to the front of the store? I mean, you're already at your car, your groceries are in there, your ice cream's melting. Should you really do that? Well, thankfully, ask no more because we have all of the answers. That's right. Welcome to the Painted Porch Strategies Book Club. I am Amy Yukowski, the founder of Painted Porch Strategies, and I'm here with Rob Hunter, our master of communication, and Sierra Ramcantrell. And we are here to meet for our monthly book club. This month, we are talking about how to Be Perfect. So worry not, you'll know by the end of this book. How to Be Perfect is a book written by Michael Schur. Michael Schur is the creator of one of our favorite shows, The Good Place. He's also one of the creators and writers for Parks and Recreation, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, The Office, and Saturday Night Live. Now, during the course of creating The Good Place, Michael went on a bit of a philosophy deep dive because one of the core premises of The Good Place is how to be a good person so you can actually get into, you guessed it, the good place. And so through this, diving into moral philosophy, he did a ton of research. He talked to a bunch of philosophers, and he said, you know what? I think I'm going to put this all in a book that the average Jane or Joe can read and understand, and maybe, just maybe, by the end, walk away with a little bit more knowledge of how to be more good and less bad. So in our first week of our book club, we looked at part one, and part one is really meant to be the introduction to this whole world of moral philosophy. And in this, we are talking about three and a half core moral philosophies, what he likes to call the big three, which are virtue ethics, deontology, and utilitarianism. Now, don't worry, we'll get into what each of those mean both in today's session, but also if you choose to read the book, you'll dig into it more. So, Sierra, Rob, first impressions as you dove into this book on how to be more good, less bad, but ideally perfect.
Well, it's a little bit of a daunting task writing a book about moral philosophy because, guys, it gets deep and esoteric real fast. Mm-hmm. But the good news is this is a comedy writer. So Michael Schur makes this funny and he makes this really accessible. He puts things in kind of an example version that's very similar. I've worked with young kids a lot, and I like the way that he kind of talks us through something that we can identify with, like the shopping cart. Like, should we return the shopping cart or should we just not worry about it? So I like the accessibility of his writing.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Rob?
I find this to be a battle of complexities, quite honestly. All the different ethics and questions, and you can dig down a million layers or you can dig down 2 layers. That's essentially what philosophy is. It's constantly questioning that next layer. Well, what about this? And what about this? One of the scenarios that he uses is the famous trolley example that maybe you've heard of, where you're on a trolley and there's 5 people ahead of you. Now you can pull this lever and you only kill 1 person instead of the 5. What choice do you make? And it goes down to the various levels of, well, how do you know this? And a lot of it is all weirdly crazy because you don't know anything about those 5 people and that 1 person, mm-hmm. So that's what I really find interesting about philosophy is how deep do you want to go?
Well, and how circular do you want to get? Right? When it comes to philosophy, that's why there's more than one school of philosophy. A lot of them didn't agree with one another. A lot of them borrowed from one another. But the 3 that he really likes to focus on are the 3 that I would say probably are the most disparate in how they measure what it means to be a good person or not. What I loved is right at the beginning, one of the big things that he talks about, and I think he gives a shout out to Aristotle here, because Aristotle is one of the OGs when it comes to virtue ethics, but he talks about the idea of failure. And the whole idea of what we're trying to do in this crazy blue globe that we're all on, in this time period that we're blessed with, is trying as much as possible to do what's right, or what we think is right, and try to avoid the things that maybe aren't so right. But he talks about that we're going to make mistakes, we're going to screw up. And the most important thing is that we keep gathering that feedback and learning from that information, from those hiccups, from those mistakes. We have, Sierra, as you like to talk about in your program, Radical Mindfulness, having that growth mindset and being willing to inspect and adapt and turn those obstacles or those little grains into pearls of wisdom that will then be able to take on to the next time we encounter the situation. He talks about when we encounter any ethical dilemma, there's really 4 questions or 4 things that we want to ask ourselves. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? Is there something that I could be doing better? And then why is it better? And so that's a lot of what we're weighing here with these different schools of Western philosophy. And we do focus on Western philosophy here, and particularly these 3 core ones: virtue ethics, deontology, and utilitarianism. Now, we here on the Painted Porch, we are focused and we are based on Stoicism. Stoicism is another variation of virtue ethics. It actually borrows a lot from Aristotle and Plato. He doesn't really get into Stoicism here, but we'll give him that pass because we have plenty that we can talk about Stoicism in our other programs and our other meetups that we have.
And he gives that caveat that he even says, this is not all, this is not meant to be exhaustive. This is some of what I have learned. And if you follow another philosophy that you love, don't be hurt,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. But all of this is intended, that the study of philosophy and why we're going on it and why we encourage you just to dip your toe. This is a very pinky toe dip into it. Now, granted, he does get into some core concepts in here that are going to force you to think about it, but dip your toe into it. So that way, really what we're trying to do is build. He said, we come into this life, and up until this moment, we have a certain house that we've built. And that house has very specific columns and pillars and ideas and rules from our experiences that we've encountered both in nature and in nurture up until now. And really what philosophy forces us and asks us to do is in some ways renovate this house. So rebuilding at the foundation so that we have a revised blueprint for how we want to live going forward to be a better person. So that way we can hopefully get into something like the good place down the road.
Well, and it brings back to these issues. Obviously, the answer to should you go up to your friend and punch him in the face is no, right? To most of us good, upstanding people.
Mm-hmm.
Like that seems obvious. And the grocery cart example that he uses, it didn't used to be a thing because we didn't have them when I worked at the supermarket when I was 16. We had employees that go out and got them all, including in snowstorms. So that's what brought me back there. But it's a simple question for me. Did you use it? Yeah, then put it back.
Well, and he does say.
I know, but what I'm saying is,
yeah,
it's getting into good and bad. It doesn't always have to be good and bad. It just has to be, just do it. Like you used it, go take the extra 4 seconds and put it back.
Mm-hmm.
Like some of those questions to me seem very simple. It's the more complex questions that you can use philosophy as a base to try to help you out, to give you a guiding light, a GPS system. It's philosophy to me are human rules made up to live by. Like, we're going to try this because as we started becoming more city living, right? Living together, we needed to create some rules to try to say, okay, can we all live in these parameters? Can we not kill each other? Can we not beat each other up whenever we feel like it? And in order to live as 330 million people in America, we need to have some rules.
Mhm.
We want to live as a world, 8 billion people, we need to have some rules. And maybe there's different rules for different people, but that's what I like about where this goes. Aside from those questions of, should you punch your friend in the face? Is like, no, how do we collectively live together in large groups? Because human beings, this is new for us. This is evolving. We used to live in small little tribes, small little villages, hunted and gathered. Maybe we hunkered down in some cases, maybe we didn't. But it wasn't until farming really started to get going that we needed to create these new rules and new lines of thinking.
Mhm.
So that's what's fun about all of this.
Mhm.
I think part of the reason why he uses the grocery cart example is because it's so anonymous. It's like there's that quote, character is what you do when nobody's watching.
Mhm.
So I think that he uses that. I mean, yeah, it's obvious. Yeah, should you return your grocery cart? Yes. But nobody's necessarily watching. Nobody's necessarily, it's not like they're going to trace the cart back to you and send you a bill or send you a warning. Like, it's very anonymous. It's very like honor system. And I think that's why he chose that example, is when it's like sometimes there's decisions we make based on big stakes, like the trolley example. That's a big stake kind of thing. And they even say, like, well, who says you should interfere at all? Maybe the trolley should just go, and if the trolley hits someone, then it's the trolley, right? It's just a circumstance. But this is like, what do you do when it's just those little things that nobody's watching but you? It's your conscience, right?
Well, and that was the beauty. That's what I love about The Good Place is, again, they take these ideas and they try to put it in a very funny, relatable way. Whether you've seen The Good Place or not, I highly encourage you to watch The Good Place if you haven't yet, because it's a great primer into some of these moral philosophy concepts. But they have this idea of a point system. And back to your point, Sierra, when it comes to the shopping cart, nobody's looking, but maybe somebody's looking. You just don't know who's looking. And it may help you accrue points or possibly deduct points in your overall good person pool. The calculation that is being made, this mystical calculation that's being made. But even without the point system being existing, it's your own internal point system as well, right? Like, how much effort are you putting in to beyond yourself, I would say. Now, when he introduces these three big three, these are just, again, the first introductions of these three. He first talks about Aristotle, and he says with Aristotle, his big focus was on happiness. He said happiness is your ultimate goal and purpose, and everything that you do essentially should in some way lead to that idea of happiness. But I like how he rephrases that. And we actually do that here on the porch as well. The term for happiness, the Greek term is actually eudaimonia. And eudaimonia, it sometimes is interpreted as happiness, but I loved how he defined it as flourishing, because happiness is sometimes that can be fleeting. Happiness is a feeling or a state of mind, whereas flourishing, I think, is a state of being. We like to say that eudaimonia is the good life. Are you living the good life? Are you at your best self, right? Like we always like to say. So they start off with Aristotle talking about that happiness and how happiness really requires two things: rational thought, being pretty clear of mind when it comes to the decisions,
Not making emotional
making.
decisions.
Not making emotional decisions, or just leading with rational thought, which we'll get more into in a moment. And then having virtue of character, which is exactly what you talked about, Sierra. What are you doing when nobody's looking? And each philosophy has their own top virtues, if you will. But, for Stoicism, their top four are wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. But basically, it's just what you're doing when no one is watching. What virtues are you possessing? Are you practicing? Now, Aristotle, he said that we are born with this potential. It's not innate in us. It actually takes practice. You have to make it a habit. Being virtuous is a habit. It's not something that you just get in your DNA or in your genes from your parents. It's often learned. Now, I would say, I think there are some, though, that are instinctively presented. I think about, and Sarah, I welcome your feedback on this. Think about when it comes to kids. There are some things that children just, I think, inherently pick up on. They have an instinct about what's good or what's bad or what's right or what's wrong, even maybe without necessarily being taught. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's the whole argument of nature or nurture. Is it something you're just born with, or is it something that's modeled or taught? And the jury is still out. I can say from my own personal experience working with other people's kids and my own kid, that I think there is a lot that is in nature. And if we look at the Stoic principle of most of us intend to do well, most of us intend to be good people from our own lens or from our own perspective. So I believe that there's a lot to do with nature. Now, do I think nurture can screw up some of those natural instincts? Sure.
Yeah. Well, to expand on that, even with the Stoic thought of most people mean to do good or mean to do right or well, there's the asterisk there that says they might just not know what good is. They haven't been shown that. Or maybe, to your point, nurture got in the way of veering them off to understand what is good. Is good what's best for me? Or is good what's best for other people? Or all of us collectively? What's the definition of good or bad?
That's why I don't like the definitions of good or bad. But I mean, really, if you want to get super philosophical, because it provides a label that my actions are better than yours. And that creates some dissonance already, some disruption to say, no. Because if the Stoics believe, which again is what we focus on here at Paint to Pour Strategies, the person that does bad is doing something based on their experiences that led them to that decision in that moment. So is it necessarily good or bad? Because to them, it's the decision they made. So that's like when he used this, I have several issues with the way he goes in this book, quite frankly, because I think that the example of the grocery cart, I'm like, okay, it's not that big a deal. Like, so what? You leave it there so you put it away. I think he's making a bigger deal about good, bad. I don't really think that that's good or bad. It just is. And I also think he misreads Immanuel Kant. I don't know if you have Kant on your plans, but I always want to bring this up real quick because he seems to think that Kant's drive towards rationality always is impossible. Therefore, we shouldn't do it because you would be paralyzed with indecision. I completely disagree with that. The whole point of Kant is to get you ready for that trolley scenario, which you might face once, twice, 3 times in your life. So the whole idea is to train to be ready for those big, huge, critical decisions that you have to make, whether it's good or bad, so that you make your decision and you're ready for it, whatever happens. That's where I think he actually doesn't go deep enough on his examples. And I think that he does an okay job, but I think there are certain disagreements that I have that make me go in a completely different direction.
But he got you to think about it. He got you to think about it, right?
And he got
that's
you
the
to
point
think
of philosophy.
and he got you to think about it and potentially grab examples that are more aligned with the type of scenarios that you might be encountering. Again, he says right up front, I'm making these ones seem very black and white. Of course you shouldn't punch your friend in the face. Of course you should put the grocery cart back. He's taking the very simplistic, the ones that you would go, sure, yeah, anybody would do that.
But not everybody picks up their dog poop. So, or puts the cart away.
Yes, very true.
But why is that? Sometimes you're lazy. Like, I'll admit, sometimes I didn't want to clean our dog's poop. I'm like, why? I was lazy. I didn't want to put the cart back. I was lazy.
Right, but that's where it goes to Aristotle and his virtue ethics, and it's a balance of the rational, the of course, if you pick it up, you should put it back. If you leave it the way you found it, right? Like that's the very rational thought. Where the virtue of character comes in is how much of that are you actually exercising? And to your point, you said sometimes you're lazy. Well, that laziness is a vice. That is not keeping, that is not exercising the correct balance or the golden mean, as they talk about with Aristotle, the golden mean of the virtue of, I don't know what it would be, maybe productivity, right? Maybe that's the virtue is productivity versus laziness. So it's trying to find that balance, knowing that sometimes you are going to be lazy, you're going to have a deficit of that particular virtue, or sometimes you might be overly productive, an excess of that virtue, where you're the person who's going through the entire parking lot, picking up all of the carts because no one picked them up. And then you're leaving the poor person whose job it is to pick up the carts going, dude, what the heck? What am I supposed to do now? You just did my job for me. Some people might not say thanks to that.
Or
So it's
might lose a
finding that
job because of
balance.
it, because everybody did it.
That's
So
very true.
there's one less person getting paid because we decided to be overly virtuous. Because ultimately, the carriage, to dig deeper, this is what I love about philosophy. That is a tool to get you to spend money in the grocery store. Therefore, you can make the moral case that is upon them to actually take care of the carts, not you, because it's their method, their tool to make you buy more stuff. So I could go down this rabbit hole for days.
We do have a time limit today.
Yes, we do.
Yes,
So I will stop there.
exactly.
Mhm.
Yes. So virtue ethics, balance of rational thought and your virtue of character, trying as much as possible to have a balance in your practice of that virtue, not practicing too much of it so that you become that person, or practicing too little of it so that you become that other person. Really trying to find that happy medium. The next one that we talk about is utilitarianism, which is screw rational thought, even the virtue component. All we really care about is what's going to make the most people happy. How is this going to benefit the most people? That is an extremely black and white philosophy that can have, I think, trip ups right out the gate, because there's so many things that you can bump into with utilitarianism and just focusing on always the happiest outcome possible. What were some of your thoughts on that one?
Well, and then this is where I get tripped up, is because then you throw out the word happy to me, and then I get all kinds of down the rabbit hole of that. Because if you just think about the word happy, okay, for somebody's version of happy is like all the free booze, drugs, strippers that you could want, right? That might make them quote unquote happy, or a hedonistic version of happy. But is that really, like, is that a true contentment? Is that actually improving life or productivity or joyfulness or like your purpose of life, your Salcopa? So like you even use the word happy and I'm like, oh gosh, I just stepped in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely that. I think that's a tricky one to go down to practice that utilitarianism, because even along with that, one person's pain is another person's pleasure. So to your exact point, when you think, okay, what's going to bring the most happiness? What's going to make the most people happy? What's going to produce the most pleasure? It can be very different across different people. And so trying to somehow find that balance and pick the thing that's just going to yield the highest rate of return, if you will, it's going to be, you're going to bump into and trip over yourself all the time.
But
Yeah.
you know, we this is what we have to grapple with. There's an infinite amount of possibilities every time you interact with someone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what philosophy is trying to get a handle on, is in how do you cause the least amount of harm and put out the most amount of what we call good, goodwill. So when I was reading this book and spending some time thinking about it, I was thinking about just in terms of the balance of how much hurt I've caused in my life. And I'm like, okay, so if I have a score, to use Michael Schur's good place analogy on how much hurt I've caused, I have a pretty good assessment of that. So now at 43, I'm like, okay, so 43 years with that obviously causing harm along the way, right? Hurt to other people. So how now at 43 do I shift gears and look at that hurt and give back in a positive way? Because I look at the hurt as me taking something, because I did something based on my needs, my emotional needs, not the other person's. So how do I shift and as often as possible put my emotional needs and urges aside for the betterment of the other person, or to at least listen to that other person? That to me is what philosophy is, and what all of these things that he talks about come together for me as, including, well, and it gets into one of the principles in the third option, which I will let you introduce. So I don't, jump the gun here.
That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you're exactly right. So the third option is this idea of contractualism and what we owe to one another. It's kind of that happy balance between rational thought, virtue of character, as well as trying to find that happy medium of benefiting the most people, or providing an opportunity for the most people to flourish. And that's where he talks about contractionalism and this book that's very prominent in The Good Place, What We Owe to Each Other by T.M. Scanlon. And he builds on that even further, talking about the idea, this African principle of Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is beyond not just what we owe to each other, but that who we are is because of one another. And that's even that broader idea.
Very stoic.
It is very stoic. It's that idea of your circles and your inner circles versus your outer circles, and the idea that we all exist in what the Stoics refer to as a cosmopolis. We are all part of one big community, and we all,
and the virtues are made to help one another.
Yep, and that we are made to help one another because we are all made of the same stuff.
And this is the one I vibe with the most. Simply, if you think about it this way, right, that we're all a team. Like every human ever that's ever been born and has ever died that is living right now is collective, right? The reason why we have homes and electricity is because other humans have paved the way for us that made our lives easier. The reason why we know how to use fire is because humans as a group passed that lesson along. The reason why we have these rules is because we had all these ancestors figuring it out way before we were around, trying to figure out, can I smash someone in the face with my club or not? We had a dispute. How do we solve it? Like in the Wild West, which was only like 150 years ago, they were like, just shoot each other. It was like, that's how far we've evolved from the very beginning of man, which is why I love this concept the most so far, Ubuntu. And it was also used by the 2008 Boston Celtics when they won the championship. That was the first time I ever heard of the word or the concept, as Michael Schur actually says too. So I really vibe with that one. A person is a person through other people.
Right. We have a social contract to one another beyond our own selves, our own eudaimonia, our own happiness. We have that social contract for others.
Yeah. Well, and this is where there's a big there's always intersections with philosophy and religion. And this is one that is a common theme in a lot of world religions, this idea of a one or a collective or a brotherhood. This is prominent in a lot of different variations, sometimes with subtle gray areas, but this whole idea that it's not just you, it's like we need to see the forest for the trees.
Yep.
And I think that is where the conclusion is so far, is that these are tricky issues. Not everything has a yes or no answer, but it's to me, it comes down to preparedness. As Louis Pasteur says, chance favors the prepared mind. That's what thinking about philosophy does. That's trying to figure out your rules and adapting those rules and not being set on those rules forever, constantly learning, constantly challenging, constantly moving forward so that you are prepared for life's big moments, whether it's the trolley example. And if you ever live such a blessed life, the biggest problem you have in your life is whether or not to put the grocery store away. But appreciate that gratefulness. Like the fact that this is the biggest issue that I face in my day. We're living pretty great because of the thousands and thousands and thousands of years that have made it so. We didn't just arrive here and be like, wow, no, we got lucky. We got born in the best time ever to be a human being in the history of human beings. So let's appreciate that and treat each other kindly.
And remember what we owe to one another. to be our best selves, both for ourselves, but also for the rest of our brotherhood or our society.
Like try not to take out your emotional past on other people, if I could phrase it so bluntly.
Sure.
Because we all have one and we all do that sometimes. Because the more I think about emotional reactions, this is what I think about in my spare time. But the more I realize those emotional expressions, those are expressions of me. They're not expressions of the other person. The other person didn't cause me to do anything. It hit me in a way that arose something that caused me to react. So my emotional reactions are incredibly selfish, based down to a base level. And now I have to reckon with that and see how my selfishness, and again, it's innate, so it's not easy to do this work, but it does impact other people. So this Ubuntu principle, I think, is recognizing your expression is your expression. And if you're trying to take out your insecurities on someone else, you're going to cause harm instead of saying, oh, like you say, Sierra, in her program, Radical Mindfulness, those triggers are gifts. They tell you something about you. It's a potential key in a lock in which you can unlock something about yourself. I think the main point of philosophy is doing that work.
And creating that habit, right? Like he talks about towards the beginning of the book, that's really the benefit, is that the more you practice it, the more you're able to recognize it and actually react in a way that will not result in consequences that are going to be greater often than the cause of the harm. You know, it's funny. We started this book last week, and it's funny that chapter 1 is, should I punch my friend in the face? And that exactly is what happened about a week ago at the Oscars, where someone did in fact get punched in the face. Had Will Smith spent a little bit more time, maybe done a little bit more practice of what he was preaching, done a little bit more of that practice, made it a habit,
he would have been ready for that.
He would have been more ready for that moment, and he would not have exercised the extreme of a rational, calm, level-headed, compassionate individual.
Well, one of my favorite tools in Rob's program, Master Your Message, is writing a rap. And he breaks it down, and RAP is actually an acronym where A is the assess. So yes, was there an emotional trigger? Yes, someone was speaking about Will Smith's wife who has a medical condition. He was upset. The assessment part was the part that I think that got skipped. And I'm sure that he has replayed it in his head and replayed it with his therapist multiple times now, where he probably just wishes if he just stepped back and maybe assessed, maybe he would have made a different decision. He might have processed that differently. So, and a lot of this philosophy is literally just getting better at that assessing step of life.
Yep, because to your point, both of you, that trigger's automatic. It's going to happen. You can't stop it. It's when you then infuse the rational thought, the rational assessment, the pause, and saying, how big of a deal is this, right? How should I reasonably react to this? And will my reaction be a reaction of virtue or a vice? And finding and but creating that space, that opportunity, and that practice to be able to catch those reactions, catch those triggers before you just let them free flow.
But it also requires another virtue of courage to do the work. Like you have to be
Yes.
courageous enough to face yourself, to not vice it away, to not explain it away. You know, that as I'm 43, I'm realizing
Mhm.
that in that, okay, are you courageous enough to do the work on yourself? Because the only way I believe to truly be good is to do your own work and to
Mhm.
realize that everything ain't about you all the time.
Yeah.
So if someone makes you mad, that doesn't give you right to slap them in the face because you're mad. You're mad for a reason. Why are you mad? Something in you was triggered, felt a certain way that made you feel something that you'd manifested as a open hand slap.
Yeah.
Instead of going, shit, that hurts. Now let me dig into that. If you need space, go find some space. Like figure out a process.
Mhm.
That's
Well, and
what I think is ultimately, I don't know if this is where he's going as we get to parts 2 and 3, but you know, in my assessment, that's it. Like work, be courageous, own yourself.
Well, I think that is part of what's going to be coming next, because in the next section, part 2, in which we take everything we've learned and we start asking some tougher questions, and we use the stuff we've learned to try to answer them. And we also learn a bunch more cool stuff. That's
Yep.
literally what it says. I'm not making this up.
So that's part 1. Part 1 was our introduction to some of the core types of Western philosophy, the big 3 over the last 2,400 years. We have virtue ethics from Aristotle. We have utilitarianism, or what's also referred to as consequentialism, the black and white, whatever is best for everybody. And then we have deontology, which is Immanuel Kant, but a variation of that being the contractualism, what we owe to one another. It's taking rational thought plus a little bit of virtue ethics, stirring in a pot and spitting out the idea of thinking greater than yourself, greater than your own flourishing, the flourishing that we owe to each other, and how we collectively grow through and with one another, with Ubuntu. So week 1, we did it. Great job. We'll continue to week 2. We're going to get a lot deeper, more than just punching faces and putting shopping carts away. We're going to dig a little deeper here and figure out how we can continue to be perfect. And by the end of this month, we'll be ready to go.
So don't forget to subscribe so you get the video first for week 2. So hit that subscribe button right here on YouTube.
Yep. So we'll see you soon. See you next week.